This video is brought to you by Ground News. In his first term, Trump took an exceptionally hardline position on Iran. He suddenly withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, imposed unprecedented sanctions that crippled the economy, and even assassinated Qasem Soleimani, a senior figure in Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. However, while there were rumours that Trump might take a similar stance towards Iran in his second term, and maybe even launch direct strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, it now looks like Trump is going to try to negotiate some sort of detente with Iran. So in this video, we're going to take another look at Trump's Iran policy in his first term, how it's apparently changed, and what might have motivated this pivot. Who's the worst politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So to understand this story, we need to start with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the JCPOA, or just the Iran nuclear deal. The JCPOA was a deal signed between Iran and 6 other countries, the US, China, Russia, France, Germany and the UK, way back in 2015, under US President Barack Obama. Under the terms of the JCPOA, Iran agreed to restrictions on its nuclear program, which the Ayatollahs had restarted in the 80s, in return for sanctions relief. Specifically, Iran agreed to give up the vast majority of its enriched uranium, reduce the number of active centrifuges, and not enrich any more uranium to the levels required for a weapon. In return, the West agreed to remove most of the economic sanctions on Iran, although some sanctions on Iran's missile program and terrorism-related activities were kept in place. For context, the West, or at least the US, first imposed sanctions on Iran way back in the 80s, but these were escalated dramatically with Bill Clinton's Iran-Libya Sanctions Act in 1996, which basically prohibited all US trade with Iran. And then again in the 2000s, with even the UN Security Council imposing sanctions on Iran once the extent of its nuclear program had become apparent. Anyway, the key thing to understand about the JCPOA is that, while it made it harder for Iran to build a nuke, it didn't make it impossible. After all, they were allowed to keep their centrifuges, reactors, and uranium. In this sense, the deal wasn't so much about eliminating Iran's nuclear program, but managing it. And Obama presumably hoped that Iran's re-entry into the international community would moderate its politics, opening the door to further cooperation and de-escalation vis-à-vis the nuclear issue. Nonetheless, for this reason, the deal was always controversial with Republicans, who were generally more enthusiastic about military action, and with America's Middle Eastern allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, who thought that the deal was too soft on Iran. This was Trump's position, which is why in 2018 he withdrew from the deal, and instead began what he called a maximum pressure sanctions campaign against the Ayatollahs, introducing more severe sanctions than ever before. Trump then took things up a notch in early 2020 by assassinating renowned IRGC General Qasem Soleimani, which nearly triggered a full-on US-Iran war until Iranian forces accidentally shot down a passenger jet flying from Tehran to Kyiv, which created international pressure for both sides to de-escalate. Anyway, Biden tried to revive the JCPOA when he got into office, but to no avail, both because the Iranians were wary that his successor would just pull out again, and because relations between Iran and the US became strained after October the 7th, for obvious reasons. Nonetheless, in part because he wanted to keep the door open, and because sanctions were impoverishing poorer Iranians without obviously influencing the Ayatollah's foreign policy, Biden was less enthusiastic about sanctions in his term than Trump. In 2022, he issued sanctions waivers for Russian, Chinese and European companies trying to trade with Iran. And in 2023, he unfroze billions of dollars of Iranian assets held in countries like Iraq and South Korea. This didn't go down well with Republicans, who accused Biden of essentially facilitating their attacks on Israel. And during the campaign, Trump promised to restart his maximum pressure campaign. There were even reports in December that Trump was considering direct strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, given that the maximum pressure policy failed to stop Iran's nuclear program last time. However, in the past month or so, the tone has changed pretty dramatically, and it now looks like Trump isn't going to be as hard on Iran as expected. There are a few reasons to think this. Last week, Trump said, quote, "It would be nice to agree a deal with Iran that didn't require military action." And Iran hawks like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton have not only been kept out of the new administration, having formed Trump's Iran policy in his first term, but also recently had their security detail revoked, despite the fact that Iran has pledged to assassinate them. When asked about this in an interview, Trump said he thought Bolton was a dumb guy, and blamed him for getting the US involved in the Middle East. Similarly, one of Trump's main foreign policy advisors, a guy called Elbridge Colby, who's long argued that the US needs to extricate itself from Europe and the Middle East to focus on China, has previously argued that the US shouldn't worry about a nuclear Iran, and advocated for a total withdrawal of US forces in the Persian Gulf. Perhaps most tellingly, earlier this month, Trump apparently gave the Iran file to Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, whose mandate is apparently to end the wars, and who is allegedly responsible for negotiating the recent ceasefire in Gaza. So what explains this apparent pivot? Well, it's probably in part because Trump's maximum pressure strategy didn't really work last time. Sure, it crippled Iran's economy, but the nuclear program and proxy network survived. It's probably also in part because of Witkoff's success in Gaza, which will have made Trump more optimistic about the prospect of a deal with Iran. And it might also be because the current Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is a moderate reformist, who will likely be more open to some sort of detente than his hardline predecessor, Ebrahim Raisi. Although we should say that Iran had a reformist president in Trump's first term, but that wasn't enough to tempt him into negotiations. However, as we see it, the main reason for this pivot is that, as we've detailed in other videos, Iran is in a uniquely weak position at the moment, and far weaker than it was in Trump's first term. Two of Iran's main proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, have been decapitated by Israel, not helped by Iran's lackluster support. One of Iran's key allies, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, was suddenly ousted in December, leaving Iran isolated and making it far harder for Iran to directly support Hezbollah and Hamas. And the Iranian regime is deeply unpopular, as evidenced by the recurring popular protests, and now faces a looming succession crisis. Ayatollah Khamenei is now 85 and lacks an obvious successor. Given Iran's weakness here, Trump probably thinks he's in a strong position to negotiate a new deal, which the Iranian regime won't be able to refuse. This is just one of many slightly wild stories coming out of the new Trump administration, and it's unlikely to get any more stable anytime soon. So if you're looking to better understand what's going on right now, thankfully there's Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organise them by story, and every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of all the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For instance, take this story about Trump putting Steve Witkoff in charge of Iran negotiations. While 41 outlets might have reported on it, you can see only 21% lean left, while 71% lean right, making it very possible you could have missed this story altogether if you were on the left of politics. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to see just how different some of the reporting can be based on these biases. One of my favourite features of theirs is My News Bias. It's basically a fitness tracker, but for news. It tracks my reading habits over time, my trends in political bias, the specific news outlets I read the most, even the specific topics I gravitate towards. It's been really helpful in minimising my personal blind spots. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers each story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features like their blind spot feed. So go to ground.news/TLDR, click the QR code here on screen, or use the link in the description to subscribe today.